Hey everybody, it's Peter, and I had a very good day. Not only because I got to ride this around, and we're going to talk about that in the next couple minutes, but also because I just got surprise pizza, and surprise pizza is very good, and there may still be some in my teeth. But what we're here to talk about is the Suzuki Hayabusa, and my question that I wanted for this riding's impression video was not how fast does it go on a track, because I'm not capable of taking it that fast. Two, there's no track nearby. But I wanted to know, is this a bike that you can actually use as a daily driver, and more specifically that I could use as a daily driver? Because I think the thing with a bike that is this legendary and this powerful is, can I use it as an everyday bike? And what's interesting is this is the 2023 model, but if you read about the updates in the 2025 model, really a lot of the go fast stuff is the same, but some of the things they've done is incorporate some technologies to help you use it as a daily driver. In other words, to take some of the intimidation out of it. So what I did with this drive is I kept it in the aggressive throttle mode, the full power mode. I kept it in the sort of aggressive throttle setting, and just traction control at number 1 because I wasn't turning that off. And I decided to find out if I could daily drive this. Now I will be clear, in some of the B-roll video you will not see me driving in town. There were 2 police officers that were right around town, and I didn't want to carry a GoPro that may or may not have been carrying some slightly incriminating information on it. So in this video what we're going to do is go through what it's like to daily drive the Hayabusa, the 2023 model. That's still very modern. This one's got about 10,000 kilometers on it, but it's not as modern as the current one. We'll talk about some of those minor technology changes in the 2025 model and above, but we'll talk about those things there. But can you daily drive this? And the answer is yes, and maybe not, and it will depend. So we're going to put it in context, and I'll answer the video with the context at the end. So it's been my goal this year to ride and drive and test and review and do walk-around reviews, especially, of as many motorcycles as I possibly can. And most of those are 2025. So if that interests you, by all means, subscribe to my channel. We've already got 2026 is coming up here in August of 2025. So I'm going to continue to try to cover as many motorcycles as I can. But one of the things I want to do is kind of get in depth with more types of motorcycles. And this was always one I've wanted to ride. So if we talk about putting this bike in a class, obviously it's a sport bike, it's a super sport bike. The difference with this over a super sport bike, a traditional super sport bike, is you can tell it is much longer and it is a little different shape and different style. It's got a lot of aerodynamic styling, and even as bikes have gone more angular for the more modern sort of segment of styling, this one still has a lot of curves to it, and the aerodynamics on this bike are real. So if we put it in a class, yes, technically it's a super sport bike, but it really is a 0 to 60, 0 to quarter mile, 0 to whatever you want, high speed type bike. So the handling is secondary on this bike to flat out acceleration at any speed, and that's one of the key differences between this and a traditional super sport bike. But we're going to start talking about some of the pieces and parts and how it all comes together in making this a daily driver and a performance bike. So let's get going with some of the things I found with daily driving this bike. So the first problem with daily driving this bike actually came to me as I actually had the bike in my possession. I was texting a friend of mine who knows nothing about motorcycles, and he found out it was a Hayabusa. He knows what a Hayabusa is. He doesn't probably know it's a Suzuki Hayabusa, but he knows what it is. And that kind of placed something in my mind as I was driving this thing home from the dealership, and I passed 2 different cops doing radar on the way home and got eyes from them. I was driving very safely, within the speed limit even, doing all the things I should do, but both of them were very much looking at me as I was going by, and that made me realize that going through with a camera and that kind of thing may not be the best option for my career here and for my ability to borrow bikes. But it is interesting with this bike when you own it, is that just like a Harley, people kind of know what a Harley is. This thing has a lot of people who know exactly what it is. So when you daily drive this bike, compared to like a super sport bike, you know, a ZX-10 from Kawasaki doesn't look a whole lot different than a, 400cc sport bike. And to the casual viewer, the Honda, let's go, we can go Honda, we can go Kawasaki, we can go Suzuki, whatever you want. But let's go with Kawasaki. The Kawasaki Ninja 500 doesn't look a whole lot different than the ZX10 to the casual viewer, but this thing does look different. People can see this thing is absolutely made for power. It looks for power. And that is something that when you are riding it, you are very aware of. This thing is a bit of a magnet for people who expect you to be going very, very fast. And that can change some of the joy in riding it. You have to be aware of that. But let's talk about the actual riding experience. So if you see my walk around reviews, you know I love to start at the front wheel because it talks about the manufacturer's intent. But in the riding impressions reviews, I want to talk about some of the stereotypes of this bike and how it actually works. So first of all, you've got obviously great brakes, the Brembo brakes, all that stuff you would expect. You've got the upside down forks and that kind of thing. You also have the Bridgestone Battle Axe Hypersport S22 tires. These are pretty common tires on a lot of sport tourers. And although this bike's geometry, a little bit longer, isn't designed to be as lightning quick handling as something like a traditional sport bike, it still is a very good sport bike. It goes around corners very well, especially higher speed corners, big sweepers. You know, going around traffic circle or something like that, it's fine. But big sweepers, you really feel like you have control. And that's because the tires here are not something that you would see on a drag strip. They're typical tires, front and rear, on what you'd see on a sport bike. So you do still have a fairly sporty ride, even though the geometry may suggest otherwise. It's still, if not flickable, it's certainly very quick to turn side to side compared to what I expected. The other thing worth mentioning is the suspension front and rear. I do have a section of road that I take when things get very rough. And I will say that generally sport bikes do not make me want to ride the bike on that section of road, but this bike actually did fairly well. Now the suspension is adjustable, I did not adjust it, but the suspension was compliant enough and responsive enough that I didn't hate driving this sport bike on that road. And that's a piece of riding this bike in daily driving. So let's just break that down a tiny bit. Ride comfort is actually a strength with this style of superbike. So first of all, this is a long bike, an elongated bike, and I just want to show you the general seating position for a second when you're in the showroom. And it's still leaned over like a superbike, but it's not terribly leaned over. It's relatively comfortable. Now I will say over time, I did appreciate the cruise control feature just to be able to kick that cruise control on for a second and be able to take your hand off. One thing worth mentioning, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to gear shifts and that kind of thing, worth mentioning on this bike is that in the 2025, you can still shift gears or use the quick shifter while it's on cruise control. So in other words, if you want to go from 5th to 6th while you're on cruise control, you can do that. On the 2023 model that I'm driving, if you did a gear shift, it would right away kick it off cruise control. It's worth mentioning because if you move from one to the next, you may be surprised that it doesn't kick it off cruise control when you do that. But flip side is, I can see the case for not kicking it off cruise control when you make those gear shifts, because this bike, as far as gear shifts go, is a very interesting animal, which we'll talk about in a second. So now, let's talk overall comfort. So first of all, you have this position like this. In general sweepers, general riding around town, that kind of thing, it's totally fine for comfort. It's, again, there are more comfortable bikes, but for a super sport, it's fine. What I was impressed with, and I don't know if it's just the long wheelbase, I think it's also the suspension tuning, is that the rougher roads were actually handled very well by this. It certainly felt compliant enough that you could take this on daily roads, daily driving, and not feel like it's beating you up. But there's a second piece to this, and of course it's the engine and the transmission. So let's talk about that now. So there's a lot of expectations that I had going into this bike. First one is, of course, you hear about it being extremely intimidating. First thing I will say is, even in the most aggressive throttle mode, even with all the settings sort of set up to a more higher spec, aggressive type ride, this thing's actually quite controllable at low speeds. The hardest part about handling a Hayabusa is your brain. It's not the bike. The bike itself can certainly feel very comfortable at any speed. It's not as high strung as a lot of other super sport bikes. It's not something that's feeling like it always has to go forward. This is a real quiet confidence kind of bike. What's weird about it is you can be at any legal temperature. You can be at any legal speed in first gear to sixth gear and it's just fine. Your gear choices are not a matter of choosing the right gear to accelerate. It's more about choosing the rate of acceleration. So if you want to downshift from 6 to accelerate, which you do not have to do at virtually any speed, even at extremely low RPMs, you can roll on a throttle in 6th gear and it will gladly take you at a very good clip into an extremely good clip, even in 6th gear. But you're choosing your rate of acceleration by downshifting. And what that means is if you just do a little roll on throttle when you're in 2nd gear, it goes lightning quick throughout all legal speed limits. If you want to roll on in 4th gear or 5th gear or 6th gear, it's still going to be very quick, but you're not so much shifting because you have to, you're shifting because you want to choose your rate of acceleration with that right hand rolling on. It's a weird thing because the engine is incredibly smooth at any RPM really. It does have some buzz that works its way in, but I mean, when you're low RPMs in any gear or just driving normally, this thing feels incredibly smooth, incredibly refined. And that, as an in-town, around town, and country road driver, actually makes this thing incredibly easy to drive. You can be in the wrong gear, it'll handle it fine. You can be too high of a gear, too low of a gear. And again, as long as you're smooth with your right hand in those lower gears, it's actually easy to drive at road legal speeds. So the first answer to your question is, if you're an experienced rider and you're thinking about delaying the Hayabusa because it's going to be too hard to ride, if you're an experienced rider, it's not going to be too hard to ride. So in that case, go buy it. But there may be a reason to not buy this bike as well. So before we get to why not to buy this bike, I do want to talk about one more thing that is a really key piece to this bike, and it's one of the reasons the styling hasn't really changed a ton. The length is there, the bodywork still has some curvature. This can be a difficult bike to ride around town because as you go tight here, I can't really twist my throttle very much because of the hand angle here to the tank and the bodywork and everything else. So it can be a little awkward working that clutch if you go on this side when it's down almost against the body, and it can be awkward working the throttle a little bit when you're full turn this way. So for driving around town, turning around really tightly in my driveway here, it's a little bit awkward. Now that's not unique to this Super Sport. It is common on some other Super Sports, but it is to me a little bit more noticeable on this bike. None of that matters though when you're at speed because, like I said, this bike being so set up for aerodynamics is a very natural bike to get down like this when you're accelerating, and you really feel like your knees are well clear and you get down and you accelerate hard. And when you accelerate hard, obviously your body's being pulled back, but you feel very much attached to the bike. And because of the bodywork, you really don't have any air on your body in a tucked position, which is a very weird feeling. The bodywork down here is always keeping your legs clear of things. Now, I did notice some heat on my legs. I don't think it was specifically because of the engine. I don't think the engine made me feel that hot, although there's certainly some heat coming off the engine. Where I was hot is it's just a really hot day today, and I really did have full clearance of my somewhat thin legs. I'm about 175 pounds, 6 foot tall. But it also cleared here and cleared my feet. My feet are always on vented riding shoes in this time of year, and I normally have a little bit more airflow to them, and it didn't have the airflow. What that means though is as you accelerate, you're dealing just with the G-forces and not the change in air pressure. And the change in air pressure, air resistance I should say, is exponentially larger as you accelerate. So 120 is exponentially larger than 100 compared to 80 to 100, if you know what I'm saying. That's a whole other video. But when you can tuck yourself completely out of that air, it is so much easier to accelerate to extremely high speeds. So if you're buying this bike because you want to have that fun and accelerate to extremely high speeds, this is a very easy bike to do that with, not just because of its power, but because it puts you in a position where you feel in control, you're out of the wind, and you can really get up to speed. Now, in and around town, what that does create sort of that sport touring type feel of a lot of wind protection in and around town. So let's just talk about why you would not want to buy this bike, and I think this is going to be an interesting one. If you are a speed demon and you've always wanted a Hayabusa and you are moving from a bike that has nowhere near the power of this, I do think you might be bored on this bike. Now that's a hard thing to say for a bike that's this exciting, but when I did my driving and I focused on purely around town driving closer to legal speed limits like I would drive a normal motorcycle, What I found is that some of the drama is missing on this bike at those speeds. It's like I said, you could be in first gear or sixth gear at basically any speed, and what that means is you're choosing to shift because you might want to, but you don't have to shift. Riding a motorcycle to me allows the bike to, run out of power and then have that acceleration, right? You have to switch those gears, you have to do those things. It's a little bit less flickable in turns, although still very flickable, but for an average sport bike, it's much more stable, and that stability is going to help it at extremely high speeds. But if this is going to be your daily driver, like I said, those sharp turns, a little bit less easy to do. The regular driving around town, because you don't have the need to shift, because you could be in, third gear or sixth gear, it almost makes no difference. It does take some of the drama out of riding a bike in and around town. And that's why, for me, the Suzuki GSX-8R would be just as enjoyable for me as a country road rider and an around town rider. Now, certainly, if I wanted pure all-out speed, this is a better bike, but I would say that there's a little bit more drama in the around town riding and around countryside roads riding in a bike like that than there is in this, because this bike does it so effortlessly, it's almost a little bit boring in fact it is a little bit more boring at street legal speeds. So the catch with this bike is, can you drive it as an everyday driver? If you're choosing this bike as your everyday ride, and because you can only have one motorcycle, if you're holding off of the bike because you're worried about its intimidation factor, I would say even in the 2023 model, not an issue, and the 2025, like I said, has some minor technology advances that are going to make that even easier to ride. So I would say don't hold off because it's too intimidating. The reason you may want to hold off, though, is if you're just looking for speed, get a 600cc superbike. Get even the GSX-8S, because you have to work through the gears on that bike and still have pretty good speed, pretty good passing power, but you'll have to downshift to pass cars. You'll have to sort of engage with the bike more than you would at this bike at regular speeds. There's less engagement with this bike in everyday driving, and that can make it kind of boring to do everyday driving. It's the whole idea of, if you drive a fast car slow, it's boring. If you drive a slow car fast, it's kind of fun. This thing is very capable of being boring and docile. What I love about it is it has this quiet confidence, and I mean that really quiet confidence. The dual exhausts here are massive, but they're not that noisy. Driving it around town, driving around a little bit of a neighborhood, and I went through in-town neighborhoods as well, just didn't get that on film, but driving it around some of those neighborhoods, you're not disrupting anyone, you're not drawing attention to yourself, but I will say, driving by the police officers, this shape definitely draws some attention to it. So it's kind of that docile, quiet confidence, but when you roll the throttle in first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and even sixth gear, it is extremely strong acceleration. It's going to go well beyond the speed limit, and that can be kind of fun. Obviously, where there are no speed limits in closed track situations, yada, 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 yada. Disclaimer, just in case my insurance company's watching. But around town, this thing is very doable. It's just not something I'd recommend, not because it's not not because it's too intimidating. It's really not that intimidating. The reason I wouldn't recommend it is because it becomes a little bit more dull. It strips some of the joy of motorcycling out because it does everything so well at low speeds that there's no engagement, there's no interaction between, in this case, man and machine. And that's why I would stay away from this as a daily rider. But if you want to go with a single ride for your everything, and you're afraid to go to this because it's too intimidating, it's not. Go for it if that's what you're thinking about. So hopefully that helps you decide if a Hayabusa is the bike for you. I would say, if you're just looking for a sporty bike, 600 Super Sport, that's the way to go. If you're just looking for flat out speed, that'll be enough speed for almost all of you. But if you are lusting after a Hayabusa and holding back for the fear, it's not a scary bike in any way. It just needs some maturity up here to keep this thing in check, because it is fun and addictive to just roll on the throttle and really rocket ship. So that's my quick review of the Suzuki Hayabusa, my driving impressions. If you have questions about this bike, by all means let me know. If you have questions about the 2025, I've already done reviews of that one as well. So we could talk about these bikes again and I can come back to them again and again. I want to thank McLean Sports for giving me complete access to their lineup, giving me some bikes. You're going to see some bikes in the next little while that I'm riding and doing riding impressions. They're all from McLean's in the next little while. So I want to give them a huge thanks, huge shout out. The link is in the description of the video. You can check them out. Thanks everybody for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.